Last time we started to look at how we can use JavaScript to access HTML elements using the DOM. We can get elements by their ID, and then we can modify their inner HTML and their style. In this lesson, we'll start to see how we can do those things in response to user events. That is, when the user clicks something, when they move the mouse, when they type something, we want to be able to modify the HTML based on what the user does. Now in this lesson and subsequent lessons, I'll be showing you examples where I'll start with what it looks like, and then we'll look at the HTML and JavaScript code. In this page, I have a button that says click me, and then underneath, it tells me the number of times I've clicked the button. When I click the button the first time, it says you've clicked the button once. The second time it says you've clicked the button 2 times, and so on. Let's see how we did that. In our HTML page, we have a button using the button tag. The button has an ID, which is click me, and then the contents that appear within the button. We also have a span that I've given the ID numClicks, and we initialize it to the value 0 times. Now let's look at the JavaScript, which is embedded into our HTML page. I have a variable called clicks, which I initialize to 0, and then I define a function called clickHandler. ClickHandler will increment clicks, and then on the next line, it will get this element by its ID, which is this span here, using the document object. Now I have a variable called numClickSpan that represents this HTML element here. If the number of clicks equals 1, if clicks equals 1, that is, that's the first time they've clicked on it, then I'll set the inner HTML of the numClickSpan object to the string once. That's how I got it to say you've clicked the button once. However, if this is the second or third or millionth time they've clicked on it, then I'll just take that number, which is the number of times they've clicked, I'll concatenate it with the string space times, and I'll set the inner HTML to that. Now, all I've done here is define this function. I haven't actually called it. I want it to be called when the user clicks the button. If I want this function to be called when the user clicks on the button, I need to add this function as what's known as an event listener. I'll do that by first using document.getElementById and the ID of my button. I'll store that in an object called button, which represents this HTML element here. So what we'll do is on the button object call the function addEventListener. AddEventListener creates a relationship between an event and a listener or some sort of function. In this case, the event is the user clicking on this button. So I didn't make up the string click here. I have to use this specific string to indicate that this is the click event clicking on that button. The listener, or the function that will be called when the user clicks on that button, is specified as the second argument, and that's the function here, clickHandler. So you'll note in this example, I never actually call clickHandler. I define clickHandler, and then I create this relationship on the bottom between the user clicking on this button and this function here. This is what's known as event-driven programming. Ordinarily, we think of a program as a sequence of instructions and function calls. We start with one function call or start with one instruction, we go to the next one, and so on until the program ends. But event-driven programming is a way of writing a program where the behavior is based on some events. For instance, in web programming, these would be things like user actions, the user clicking on something, moving the mouse, etc. In event-driven programming, the program is a set of what's known as callback functions. These are functions that are kind of sitting around waiting to be called based on some event or action. Event-driven programming is a form of what's known as asynchronous programming. In synchronous programming, we're expecting some user input, and we keep checking, did they enter it, did they enter it, did they enter it, and so on, until the user enters what we're looking for, and then we continue, we run some code. In the event-driven or asynchronous manner of programming, we're expecting some user input, but we just tell the browser, let me know when the user did what we're waiting for, and call this function when they do it. Maybe some other code is running until the browser calls the function that we're waiting for, but only when they've done what they need to do, the browser calls our function. Here's another example where I have some text that reads "put the mouse here," and then some other text below it. And when I put the mouse here, some of that text turns red and bold, and some does not change at all. So in this example, we'll see how we can use an event listener to modify other HTML elements. Up here, we've created 4 divs. We've got the first div, which I've given the ID mouse over me, and the text "put the mouse here." The second div is in a class called highlight text. Remember the difference between an ID and a class. Only one element in the entire HTML page can have this ID, but multiple elements in the HTML page can be in this particular class. The next div does not have an ID, it does not belong to any class, but then this fourth one is in the highlight text class, the same class that's here. Now we get into our JavaScript. We're going to define a callback function called makeBold that is just going to sit here waiting to be called by the browser when something happens. In the makeBold function, we'll get the elements, not a single element by its ID, but all of the elements within this class. So previously we saw getElement by ID, which returned a single element. Now we see getElements by class name that returns multiple elements. We'll store them in an array called divs. As we see here, there are 2 elements that it will return, these 2 divs that are in the highlight text class. Because divs is an array, we can iterate over each element in that array. And for each one, we can use the style property of that element. We'll set the color to red, and we'll set the font weight to bold, which will make the text appear in bold. Now, once we've changed the text to red and bold, we want to be able to change it back or restore it when the user moves the mouse away from the mouse over me text. So I'll define another callback function called restore. This is going to get the same elements by their class, iterate over them, but now in this case set the color back to black and the font weight back to normal. Now again, we haven't called these functions, we haven't actually done anything with these functions. They're just sitting there waiting for the browser to call them. So how do we tell the browser to call these functions depending on certain user events? Well, we need to get an element by its ID, in this case the mouse over me ID, which is this div up here, and we will save that element in a variable called mouse over me div. Then we will add another event listener. In the previous example, the event listener that we added was for the event called click. Here, it's for the event called mouse over. This is a special string that's used by the browser to register a listener for this particular event, where the user moves the mouse over this HTML element. When the user moves the mouse over this HTML element, the browser will call the makeBold function, which is this function here, which will modify those other HTML elements. Similarly, when the user moves the mouse away from that div, away from that element, that's the mouse out event. On the mouse out event, we're telling the browser to then call the restore function. That will call this function here, which will get those other elements in this class and set them back to black and normal. So we've seen clicking a button and we've seen moving the mouse over some HTML element. Now let's see how can we handle keyboard input. In this case, we have a text box and a message on the bottom that says hello guest. When the user types something in the box, for instance Chris, and hits the enter key, we want to change from guest to that person's name. We also want to change the background color to blue, and we want to capitalize the first letter. So here's the code for that. We have an input element or an input field that we've given the ID name input, and we have a span which is default to the word guest. We've given it the ID name field. Now we have the callback function. This function I've called name handler, and you see in this case there's a parameter called E. E stands for the event, and we're going to use it to figure out which key did the user press. In particular, we're going to get its key code property, and we'll check it against the value 13. Now 13 is a special value which represents the enter key. So we want to know if the user typed the enter key. If they did, we want to get the name input element, which is this input box. We want to get the name field element, which is this span here. And we want to set the HTML in the name field to the value in the input box. That will copy the value from the input box into that span, but we also want to change the background color to that light blue or cyan color using the name field style property. And then we can capitalize the first letter of each word using the text transform property in the style. But we're not done yet because we need to make sure that the name handler function is a listener for the user hitting a key. Which HTML element should be listening? Well, it's really all of them. So we'll add this event listener to the entire document. That is, regardless of where the mouse is or where the focus is, where they've clicked, anytime they hit the key up event will fire. It will invoke the name handler function that we've defined. And if what they typed was the enter key, then it will run this code here. In summary, we can use event-driven programming in JavaScript to modify the HTML based on user activity. That is, we define callback functions and associate them or relate them or register them with various events by adding them as event listeners. The syntax is that given some element, we use its add event listener function and pass the event and the name of the callback function. In this lesson, we've seen 4 events: click, mouse over, mouse out, and key up.